long lines and new faces at airports across the country, overseas conflicts and the impacts on the economy. Plus, America's talking. This is the Center Square Daily for Monday, March 23rd, 2023. I'm your host, Greg Bishop. The travel strain continues. Are you planning to travel for spring break? Well, you may see some long lines and some new faces at airports. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents arriving at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport Monday as security wait times continue to increase. The Center Square Associate Editor Kim Jarrett reports the airport posted on its website that passengers should arrive at least 4 hours before their flights. Hartsfield-Jackson's one of the largest and busiest airports in the country. Transportation security officials working without pay as a partial U.S. government shutdown continues. President Donald Trump ordered ICE to airports over the weekend as that shutdown persists, leading to lengthy delays for passengers. Now, Democrats in the U.S. Senate Friday may again refuse to vote in the funding for the Department of Homeland Security. While ICE is funded through the so-called Big Beautiful Bill Act that passed Congress last summer, other agencies such as TSA, Coast Guard, Secret Service, Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Security Agency, they have ceased non-essential operations and they face work shortages. This latest shutdown has lasted more than a month with no end in sight, and unpaid TSA agents, they've been calling in sick as the shutdown drags on, leading to sometimes 4-hour lines at security checkpoints at airports. All this happening as spring break travelers looking to escape to get some warmer weather. Now, Democrats withholding their votes on funding DHS, they want to require Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents to wear body-worn cameras and visible officer identification to identify themselves. They also want to limit immigration enforcement activities at various sensitive locations like schools and hospitals. They want to expand enforcement de-escalation training, and they want to mandate that the department report to Congress on compliance to these rules. Now, this morning, the president posted that he's a big proponent of ICE wearing masks as they search for and, as he says, are forced to deal with hardened criminals. But he went on to say that he would greatly appreciate no masks when ICE is helping our country, he says, out of the Democrat-caused mess at the airports. Now, border czar Tom Homan, he told CNN Sunday that ICE agents, they would be assisting in basic security needs, such as guarding airport entrances and exits and not conducting security line checks or bag inspections, which they're not trained to do. Now, cancellations impacting airports across the country, but cancellations and delays at North America's 7th busiest airport were actually down 90.7% and 35.5% respectively for the Friday, Saturday, Sunday weekend compared to just the week before. The Center Square managing editor, Alan Wooten, reports the spike March 13th through the 15th at Charlotte Douglas International Airport coincided with the first full paycheck missed by TSA workers. Numbers were also down at North Carolina's other two primary outlets in the Triangle and Triad. Nationwide, about 1 in 10 TSA workers have been absent daily for roughly 2 weeks. Queen City Media, they report Monday that they were told by the Charlotte Douglas officials they have not seen ICE at the airports. As of Monday, Charlotte Douglas over the weekend had 15 cancellations, 813 delays. All according to FlightAware. The previous weekend, it was 163 and 1,260, respectively. In a social media post during the weekend, Charlotte Douglas wrote, TSA remains essential to safe and effective travel at CLT, helping passengers stay on track while upholding the airport's security culture. They further said, as officers continue reporting to work without base pay during the ongoing government shutdown, CLT is organizing a gift card donation to support them. And even Tesla and SpaceX founder Elon Musk offering to pay the salaries of Transportation Security Administration employees to help ease the long waits at airports. Musk obviously is a billionaire. And with the ongoing partial government shutdown, now the second longest in American history, irritated Republicans in Congress are berating Senate Democrats who for the 5th time Friday blocked the advancement of the Department of Homeland Security funding bill. The Center Square's Therese Boudreau reports that failed vote highlights how firmly Democrats are entrenched in their opposition to any fiscal year 2026 Homeland Security funding that doesn't include an extensive list of new restrictions on immigration enforcement operations. And again, with no federal funding for DHS agencies, that's the TSA, the Coast Guard, Secret Service, Cybersecurity, and Infrastructure Security Agency, they've ceased those non-essential operations. Now, since the U.S.-Israeli-Iran conflict began in February, multiple attempted and successful Islamic terrorist attacks have occurred on U.S. soil in the states of Michigan, Virginia, New York, and other places. In a social media post Friday, Senate Majority Whip John Barrasso blamed the increased violent incidents on Democrats' refusal to reopen DHS. He said Americans need and deserve safety and security. He went on to say Democrats are preventing it, and they have blood on their hands. And that's a quote. Meanwhile, as the DHS funding lapse continues, the president says the U.S. is very close to meeting objectives in Iran. The Center Square's Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief Sarah Roderick-Fitch reports that the president added the U.S. is considering winding down military operations. He made those comments in a Truth Social post Friday, but this morning, the president posting to Truth Social that he's pleased to report that the United States of America and the country of Iran have had, over the last 2 days, very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of our hostilities in the Middle East. Based on the tenor and the tone of these in-depth, detailed, and constructive conversations, President Trump said he's instructed the Department of War to postpone any and all military strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for a 5-day period. In other posts, Trump underscored Iran will never get close to a nuclear-capable country, allowing the U.S. to quickly and powerfully react to such a situation should it take place. Now, the latest development comes as the strikes began 3 weeks ago, and multiple reports indicating several thousand Marines are en route to the region. However, Trump refused to confirm that. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has taken center stage this week as NATO allies have sparred with the president over commitments to help secure the strait. And as of Friday, DHS shutdown, it's cost the U.S. economy $2.5 billion, according to the Council of Economic Advisors. But what about the effects of the economy from the ongoing overseas military operations in Iran and the ongoing crisis around the Strait of Hormuz? And now for the Center Square Daily, let's talk about how the military operations overseas could possibly be impacting you, the taxpayer, and the economy, with a conversation we'll have with Orphe Divounguy, a Ph.D. economist, and he joins us now. Orphe, thanks for taking time with us. As someone who's studied economic history, your insight on what we could have seen in the past and how it typically transmits into a broader economic picture, these types of large-scale military operations.
Yeah, hi, Greg. Thanks for having me. So I think I'm glad you mentioned the transmission channel, right? The primary economic transmission from a conflict of this scale runs through 3 channels: energy markets, financial conditions, and fiscal, right? The fiscal impact. And the most immediate is, of course, energy. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products transited the Strait of Hormuz daily before the conflict. When that choke point is disrupted, the shock is global and fast. Most economists will remind you of the crises of 1973, 1978, right? As evidence that every time we get an oil shock, right? A spike in oil prices, we usually get a global slowdown.
When we look at the recent history here, I mean, oil spiking considerably just in the past week, that is seen in previous operations, say World War II and any kind of operation there in between.
No, I mean, you'd have to go back to the 70s, right, where we had a similar type of conflict. And when I say similar, it was much larger. This is still very small, and hopefully it won't last very long, right? The impact will get worse if the conflicts last, right? And so that's, I think that's an important point to make. The other point to make is that there is a little bit of nuance, right? The U.S. became a net exporter of oil. And that's a positive, but that doesn't insulate consumers completely from the price spikes, right? Despite record levels of domestic fuel production, the U.S. is more exposed than ever to global fuel interruptions. because a decade of infrastructure building has linked domestic supply to overseas markets, right? Oil prices are set on the global market, and nearly half of the cost of gasoline is the crude oil from which it is refined. So American producers might benefit a little bit from higher prices. Their revenues might rise, but American consumers still pay the global price at the pump. So it's really a distributional story within the U.S., right? It's not a complete shield. You're going to have some winners, but most consumers could be losers.
Now, we don't know the duration of this current operation. Congress has taken some votes, but still no declaration of war. The administration telling us it's going to be a short operation. But what are some of those headwinds that people can look for that have been seen in the past, either during or after these types of major geopolitical conflicts?
Yeah, of course. The headwinds, right? As I mentioned, the consumers in the first few weeks after the conflict began, right? The average price of gasoline in the U.S. soared, right? We saw, and it's still rising, right? Higher oil prices also feed into electricity, fertilizer, food, plastics. Broad cost of living price increase. For monetary policy, right? We watched the Fed this week, right? Instead of lowering interest rates, right? What the Fed did is it held rates steady. And the reason it did so was because, if you look at the summary of economic projections, more and more FOMC members believe that inflation could be slightly higher than they had initially anticipated, right? So slightly higher inflation, slightly lower economic growth, and the Fed is kind of stuck, right? It looks at the labor market. It's a labor market that's not producing new jobs. Labor market has essentially stalled in 2025, and yet when you look at the inflation picture, right, inflation is not coming back down to target. That's a big problem. You probably saw the IMF managing director in the news last week talk about the fact that a prolonged conflict would be an inflationary risk to the economy, right? While at the same time lowering global economic growth, right? For low-income households right here in the United States, it's especially painful because they see a larger share of their paychecks going to necessities, pumping gas in your car to get to work, right? And that's why we should be concerned.
Orphe, we recently with the Center Square Daily looked at some of the trends from recent history when it comes to oil prices and pain at the pump, so to speak, right? We, of course, seen the increase in the gas prices most recently, some giving the reason to the conflict in Iran. But go back to 2022 when we had that 9.1% inflation for all goods in that summer. And gas prices then were, like $5 a gallon in some places of the country. What was behind that? Was that the global conflict between Ukraine and Russia?
No, I think when you look back at the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, it was some farm products, right? Some soybeans and others, right? The things that Ukraine really exported to the world. And so that wasn't really the problem. I think we went through an inflation surge because of a combination of things on the policy front, right? So we had the big fiscal stimulus that came after COVID or during COVID, where almost every household had some sort of check coming from the government, while at the same time the Fed had lowered interest rates. Completely different scenario, but the pain was very much similar, right? You felt it at the pump, you felt it at the grocery stores.
Yeah, I don't think regardless of what caused it, people still felt it.
Exactly. Now it was a bit different in the sense that at least at the time, the labor market was on fire. And so you remember, people were quitting their jobs because they could find better opportunities, right? Today, that's no longer the case. Right, the labor market has cooled significantly, and we went from what economists call the Great Resignation to the Great Stay. People are not quitting their jobs anymore because job openings are actually now below the number of job seekers, and it's become very, very difficult to get a new job or to even get a raise for those who are currently employed, which is why I think when you look at monetary policy, the Fed's usually very concerned about inflation expectations. If people believe prices are going to go higher and they have more bargaining power on the job, they're able to negotiate higher wages, which then creates this wage price spiral that the Fed is trying to avoid. In the current situation we're in right now, it's very unlikely we'll see a wage price spiral because workers have less bargaining power, because there's just not enough jobs out there for everyone, and the labor market has slowed tremendously, which is another way of saying, the Fed could probably look through this current price shock to help support a very weak labor market.
Talking with Orphe Divounguy, a Ph.D. economist, to get some insight on the economic consequences and bellwethers, so to speak, when there are international conflicts, especially as people are seeing increased gas prices and some worried it's going to add to inflation. And talking about the jobs market, Orphe, an interesting kind of factor to work into all of this. But talk about some of the economic sectors that may benefit or be improved, or some kind of impact to them during these types of military conflicts.
Totally. A potential tailwind is going to be for U.S. energy producers, right? Higher global oil prices mechanically boost revenues for domestic producers. But this is essentially an income transfer from U.S. consumers to the energy sector. And so also maybe the defense sector, right? I watched the news yesterday. They talked about another $200+ billion needed for military operations, right? And so the defense sector, U.S. energy producers might gain some from the current situation, but ultimately, higher government spending with basically deficit financed spending could have potentially put pressure on prices, right? We talked about the oil price shock, but ultimately that oil price shock is already lifting interest rates higher. So that's, despite the small positive here, ultimately the conflict could be a net negative for global economic growth and even for U.S. economic growth because of the impact on interest rates, right? Interest rates are rising. The Fed, prior to 2025, the Fed was on a path of cutting interest rates. That is no longer the case. The Fed, if you look at the summary of economic projections, it signals maybe one more rate cut in 2020 and 2026. But we'll have to wait and see, especially if this conflict continues to go on.
Yeah, if it's a protracted conflict like we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq, you can definitely see some of those economic conditions down the line. Orphe, finally here, obviously when government does something, the taxpayer pays for it, right? Even if the government's paying for itself to have vehicles with higher fuel costs, that's paid for by the taxpayers. But how are consumers, how are taxpayers impacted in different economic spectrums, right? Are those who make more money going to be feeling this versus those who don't make as much money? Talk about that a bit.
I think everybody's going to feel it. It starts at the pump, right? You look at the oil shock, right? Global oil shock is causing gas prices to increase, so everyone's feeling it. But ultimately, people with lower income households are going to disproportionately be impacted, right? So, I'll take a very simple example. If you're working from home, right, you don't actually have to go to the pump every day and fill up, right, to go to work, right? And so lower income families, certain types of workers will be disproportionately affected. But ultimately, you look at interest rates and what's happening to interest rates. Mortgage rates in the housing market had dipped below 6% in February, and they've been rising since then. Right now, mortgage rates are up to roughly 6.2 according to Freddie Mac, 6.4 when you look at Mortgage News Daily. And so interest rates are going to be affected. They're moving up, not down. And so, again, that's going to affect the average household.
No question about it. Orphe, we're going to have to connect again on this issue as we see this continue and to get more of those projections and, understandings of how exactly all this is impacting the taxpayer and those in the everyday economy. Greatly appreciate you taking the time with the Center Square Daily. Now it's time for America's Talking, with stories across the country that you will find at thecentersquare.com. And we start with the Colorado House voting on a flurry of bills to end the week last week, approving 2 major gun regulation bills and others. The Center Square contributor Liam Hibbert reports legislators voted 34-28 Friday in favor of HB 261126, the requirements for firearms dealers bill. That bill now goes to the Senate. It requires background checks for not just the gun dealer, but also employees and people who have a say over store policy. Dealers would also need to get a permit to transfer firearms in or out of the state. The bill would additionally require record keeping for all firearms in a gun dealership, which currently only applies to select weapons. The Colorado bill also allows for increased penalties to gun dealers by the state and higher standards on gun scrutiny at the store. The other major gun bill under consideration, Senate Bill 26004, the Expand List of Petitioners and Protection Order bill. It was passed on a 39-24 vote in Colorado and now heads to Governor Jared Polis. The Democrats expected to sign the law, which was supported by the Democratic majority in the House and Senate. And another bill in Colorado, SB 26004, it expands who could petition for extreme risk protections. Professional and personal relationships, such as family members and teachers, can already file extreme risk protection orders for individuals who they believe to be a high risk of danger to themselves or others, which temporarily removes their access to firearms. This bill would allow institutional petitioners, such as healthcare facilities and schools, to apply. Several Virginia lawmakers voted alone against the rest of their chamber multiple times during this year's General Assembly session, opposing bills tied to energy policy, artificial intelligence, government transparency, and state regulation. The Center Square's Shirlene Guerrera reports data from the Virginia Public Access Project identified a group of lawmakers who cast at least 2 solo votes on the floor during legislative session, a category the organization refers to as the Contrarian Caucus. Among them, Delegate Eric Zier, a Republican who voted against multiple measures that ultimately passed. He opposed House Bill 323 in Virginia, which directs the Department of Energy to study the reuse of waste heat from data centers. He also voted against House Bill 346, which deals with Freedom of Information Act provisions. Moving on to California, during the past 7 days, Senator Ana Caballero announced implementation of her successful 2025 bill, Senate Bill 72, that modernizes California's water plan. The Center Square's Madeline Shannon reports that bill directs the state's Department of Water Resources to build the infrastructure to support the capacity to hold an additional 9 billion acre-feet of water by 2040. According to the text of the bill. On Tuesday, Republican Assemblywoman Leticia Castillo announced a bill that would restrict the use of bathrooms, locker rooms, showers, dressing rooms, and other intimate spaces by biological sex. The bill in California was inspired by the experiences of women who have encountered transgender individuals who were born male in women's locker rooms and other private places. Again, that's a bill from a Republican in California. Meanwhile, members of California's Progressive Caucus, which consists of 37 Democratic lawmakers, they also unveiled their 2026 legislative priorities last week, which included bills on health care, artificial intelligence, child care, cost of living, and ending the state's biggest corporate tax break. And finally, 2 are confirmed dead, dozens more injured, at an Air Canada jet slamming into a fire truck as it landed late Sunday in New York. The Center Square regional editor Kristen Smith reports, according to a statement from LaGuardia Airport released early Monday, the airliner carrying 72 passengers and crew members struck a Port Authority aircraft rescue and fighting vehicle that was responding to a separate incident. New York and New Jersey Port Authority executive director said the pilot and co-pilot were killed in the crash, while 41 others were taken to local hospitals. 32 have since been released. The Port Authority, they had some suffered injuries in that accident, but No life-threatening injuries there. And that is America's Talking, here for the Center Square Daily. From my studios in Central Illinois, I'm Greg Bishop. You can join us back here Tuesday for more stories impacting you, the taxpayer, from around the country, only with the Center Square Daily.